Joshua, there has been a lot of news in the world of college football in the last 24 hours. Bill Belichick, who won 6 Super Bowls as the head coach of the New England
I mean,
Patriots, second most all-time wins in the NFL, is now a Tar Heel. Like, I'm looking at these graphics that North Carolina put out, and it is jarring. It is jarring just to see him, like, not in a Patriots hoodie, if I'm being completely honest.
yeah, I totally agree. And I'm going to tell you this. The weird thing is we looked at this coaching cycle, you and I both, and we were like, not a lot is expected to happen. Not a bunch of like these big jobs that like a bunch of people are going to be going after. And it's like, even with this cycle, I do think we've gotten some crazy movement. Like I think Barry Odom to Purdue, we had talked about a little bit, like really good move. You're hearing Dan Mullen potentially out there, UNLV, like that's – but Bill Belichick to UNC, like that was on nobody's bingo card. This is crazy.
Yeah, it completely crazy. He has never coached in college football. He did spend time around the sport this past year. You know, we had a number of Washington games, and his son Steven is the defensive coordinator for Jedd Fisch. I remember when we were out there in the spring, and I was with Matt Castle, our colleague here at NBC, and like he knows, you know, obviously the Belichicks really well. And we talked to Steven a lot about, you know, why he wanted to coach in college versus the NFL. And a lot of what Jedd Fisch was trying to do and like all of their branding around their facility was like, be a pro. It was all leaning into their pro ties, and they had a lot of sons of famous coaches. And Bill Belichick was around a lot. Like he was around to the point where they had an office that he could use. There was a treadmill that he could use. Like he was definitely around the college game because this was his first season not coaching or working in the NFL in some capacity since like 75. I mean, the man has been one track and also one level for a really, really long time. And I think that's what's so shocking. And we can talk about this from both sides. Let's start with the Belichick side about why he wanted to do this. My understanding is he wanted to coach, right? So he didn't get an NFL job in the last cycle, which I think surprised a lot of people after he got, you know, the messy divorce with the Patriots. So I guess he didn't want to wait, or maybe he didn't have a good feeling about how the NFL cycle was going to go. I mean, he is 72. You know, there's a lot of talk of, you know, kind of the way he treats people, the way he runs things, the amount of control that he wants. Like, would he have been able to get that? But he didn't wait a few weeks. I mean, to make this decision to go to North Carolina here in early to mid-December is ahead of the NFL hiring cycle. So I think that's really interesting. And to me, it says, I just want to be on the sidelines. I want to be labeled head coach again.
Yeah, I mean, I think the NFL thing is really interesting just from that perspective. And like, you know, there are plenty of other people you could talk to NFL about that are a little bit more dialed in, but just kind of reading the tea leaves, like he is a guy who was head coach and GM for a long time. I think organizations are trepidatious of giving up that type of control. He, you know, the last handful of drafts that he had really weren't that great. He was never great at drafting like wide receiver skill, for example. Like I think people are a little bit scared of that. And then there is a conversation that's looming in the back of folks' minds, whether people in media want to be honest about it or not. But there's kind of the how much of it was Bill and how much of it was Tom, because there was the Cleveland Browns where he coached and it did not go very well. And there were some years with the Patriots where Tom Brady, you know, early on in his career or afterwards, where the seasons didn't look that well. And I do think those thoughts are looming. If you are somebody who, you know, Bill Belichick, who's just dialed in, right? And like you've been around the sport forever, you have every connection you could ever need. I think he probably saw that coming and said, okay, I can carve myself out a new path around a sport that I grew up around. His dad was a college football coach forever. And then a sport that you just spent the last year around. You're close with Nick Saban. Like you've talked to all the people, you know, Brett Bielema talks about the relationship he has with Bill Belichick. I think he did enough information gathering that he felt comfortable with this new frontier for him, which is college football.
Right. And I think when you look at what college football is becoming, we talk about this all the time, it's getting more professionalized, right? So if you look at this and say, okay, the revenue sharing is expected to start next fall. So schools are going to spend up to $20 million per year to pay their athletes directly. You're going to have to manage that. You're going to have to figure out like how you're going to value each position and individual players, returning players, recruits. Like there is a lot of roster management that is different. And I think that's why we've seen a number of schools bring in experts in cap management and people who have experience with that type of thing from the pros. So I get that, like, okay, the GM background, pro background, NFL free agency, not that dissimilar to the transfer portal. Like,
Oh,
I understand that type of skill set is appealing, and I get selling yourself as that because you are 72. This is a 5-year deal that you're taking. Like, it's not, we're not talking like this is going to be forever. Although it might. I wouldn't want to say this as an aside. I know it's a college football show, but people always thought he wanted to get a head coaching job in the NFL to break the wins record.
right.
Feels like maybe you're punting on that now and you're saying like, nope, I'm good with that. I'd rather just coach. Like, what's your read on that?
Would getting that record change anybody's opinion about him right now? Like, it would be nice for him to have, certainly, but everybody agrees that he's the greatest coach that's ever coached in the NFL. So I don't think for him in like legacy, it would mean all that much to say that he had that record. I think he just wants to coach at this point.
That's what I think too, but I do think legacy and some of that stuff does end up mattering to some of these coaches. But agreed, I think you could already just say he's the greatest ever, and the 6 Super Bowls and 8 total that he's been a part of certainly speaks to that. But so from the North Carolina side, again, so you're saying like, okay, he understands pro football, college football is moving into a pro area, but like there are still so many questions that make this like a really high risk, high reward hire for North Carolina. And the reason it took so long to happen, because usually, it's not like he was coaching. So you could have made this happen pretty quickly, but there were different factions at North Carolina. And clearly, like, there were members of the board of trustees that were pushing for things, athletic department looking at different candidates. Now we know that there were other candidates in the mix, like a Tommy Rees, Jeff Monken. There were some other names that could have been options here. But ultimately, everyone got on board enough to go with Bill Belichick and to spend to bring him in. But I think, again, the reason it's a high risk, high reward is he has no experience directly in college football. And you have to think like, okay, how is he going to hire? How is he going to structure this? I do think with someone who is the GOAT in the NFL, you're going to give some leeway, right? Like, you're going to be like, okay, well, you can hire a GM that is more of like an NFL GM who can do a lot of the stuff. You don't have to do all the little things. Like, maybe you don't have to meet with all the donors the way that, a 40-year-old head coach is going to have to do that. Maybe you don't have to travel around to do all of the recruiting. And other people can do that, and we bring them to you, or you can adjust some of that stuff. But there's just a lot of
recruiting thing. By the way, we've seen that with Prime, where Prime
he doesn't really travel
Boulder
at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So to your point, yes.
Right. I think that you can make some specific rules, right, for the way that Bill Belichick is going to do some of this stuff. But Joshua, I mean, there's so many hats you have to wear as a college football coach that you don't in the NFL. Like, we talk about this all the time, that the guys who go to the NFL, they get to kind of just coach football, get a better schedule. Everyone you're dealing with are pros. Like, it's very cut and dry. You now are reporting to a university president and a board of trustees and an athletic department. You have to recruit teenagers. You have to re-recruit guys on your own roster all the time because they could always just go in the transfer portal. You have to meet with donors and schmooze all the time as well. Like, there's a lot of different pieces to this puzzle. And you don't get that much time with your players. Like, it's not like the pro structure, and there's going to be days where they have classes or someone has a breakup. And there's just like so much more messiness, I feel like, with 18 to 22-year-olds that you don't deal with in the NFL, even though you do have some young guys. It's not quite the same dynamic as coaching college guys. Like, it's just a lot of different roles that you have to play.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was watching some of the coverage of people talking about it on TV, and like I kind of hate the way that the NFL folks have covered this, kind of dropping into our sport. But Louis Riddick on ESPN does a phenomenal job covering the NFL and does a phenomenal job covering college football. He's really into both, and he played for Bill Belichick in Cleveland. And one of the things he said was he's curious how this adjustment is going to go for him as a guy when he was a pro coach. He really didn't care about your personal life and how it was affecting the football thing. He's like, come in, be a professional, and do your job. This is college. Like, you kind of got to be dad sometimes. You kind of got to be a counselor sometimes. And like, if dudes feel like you do not care about what's going on, they will hop in the portal. Like, this free agency thing that people say exists in college football is very different than what Bill Belichick is used to, because in free agency, you sign a guy to a contract and you're bound by the contract. In college football, dudes will come in, they don't like it for a year, and they will leave, and they won't think twice about it. And you kind of got to balance that whole thing there. So I'm curious. I know somebody who works in the Patriots organization. He's been there for about a decade now. And he said they used to bring people in to do seminars on how to connect with millennial players and how to connect with Gen Z players. Because Bill Belichick's been this thing for so long, he kind of had to learn how to do the thing with different generations, right? And I think it's kind of like he's going to have to learn to do the thing with college players who are like totally different than anything even I've seen. It wasn't that long ago when I was playing. So I do think there's this idea from folks that are like, if it works, it's going to be a home run. But there are so many layers to how you build the roster, how you build the program. He came in with 400 pages of things he was going to do. And I think some of us were laughing where it's like, yeah, like every college coach right now is doing these things.
The idea of bringing a GM and the role of a GM.
Everybody has a GM.
Some are better than others, but everyone has them. I mean, that's what I think is going to be fascinating. And obviously, the media spotlight in Chapel Hill is going to be like what it was in Boulder, right? When Deion Sanders came in. But Deion Sanders did coach at different levels, and he had worked at an HBCU. Like, he did understand college a little bit more. But it's going to be that type of attention and fascination on this type of experiment. And the track record of pro coaches coming to college is not great. No. You're thinking that maybe it's a little different with this specific day and age and the fact that it is the GOAT. But I think that it's going to be a lot harder than people realize for Bill Belichick to do this.
Well, I think one of the things that folks are talking about is like, what kid wouldn't be wowed when they walk in and they see the Super Bowl rings and he was like, I can tell you how to be a pro. My response to that is, if I'm recruiting against them, is he can't tell you that. All he did was pick the guys that were already pros. Like, we made the guys for him. Like, do you trust him to develop wide receivers more than the guys that are coming out of Ohio State and LSU right now? Right? Like, do you trust him to do quarterbacks better than Lincoln Riley? Right? Like, if I'm recruiting against him, I'm going to ask all of those questions to the kids. Like, we have done this forever. We've gotten the guys ready for him to take on. He's never gotten them ready to go to the next level. So it's a big question mark there and how that resonates with people.
Also very curious with the staff. I mean, some of the names we've heard, it's a lot of retreads from NFL circles.
Some of these guys ain't good coaches, by the way.
No. Have to assume that Stephen Belichick will be there with him.
Yeah, and he's a good coach.
Son. Yeah, and he's good. He's a good coach. He understands college. He actually really meshes college and the pro stuff really well. Yeah. But yeah, it's going to be really, really interesting. And I don't think it's a slam dunk, as everyone says, because people said that every time that an NFL coach comes into college. They're totally different jobs. It's not the JV version of the same sport. They're entirely different sports. And it's frustrating that people keep framing it that way, that this is some step down. It's shocking because he's never coached in college, but it's not like it's an easier job, and certainly not for his skill set and where he is in his career. It's not easier.
It's two different sports, right? Like the whole step down, step up thing, like it really is from the coaching perspective. I think for the player perspective, certainly you could say step down, step up. I'm cool with that. Yeah. As a coach, it's a different job where you're looking at a different sport. And so it's going to be interesting. Final thing I'll say, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but this idea of time and how much time he gets to spend around players. He is a guy who has a system that is good for everything, and it is very complex. Do you get to teach all of that? Right? Like for Washington, for example, with his son, the defense was really good against the pass. I don't know how great it was against the run. Like I don't know if he had the time to teach every in and out of that defense the way he would have to the guys he was coaching in the NFL. And it's going to be one of those things, like they're going to be sitting in the meeting and it's like, coach, I got to go to class. I got to go to study hall. Yep. Like I can't be here. And you can't force me to be here either, because we got time limits. Y'all had the CBA in the NFL. Sounds good. We got the NCAA telling you how much we can and cannot do.
It's going to be fascinating. We're going to talk about it so much this offseason. I'm going to call it an experiment because it feels like it is. And we will see. People are going non-traditional, right? Deion Sanders first, and it worked. And they won a lot of games, and they increased admissions and all of the things that you want when you make an exciting out-of-the-box hire. North Carolina
even that thing, though. I mean, Shador's walking out the door, and so is Travis,
Oh,
right?
I know.
Like,
Well, if Bill Belichick can bring in like the number one quarterback in a draft and
yeah,
a unicorn that's a Heisman Trophy winner, then yes, Bill Belichick
yeah,
is going to work
right.
at North Carolina. One more point that I'll note as well is we're moving into this revenue share era. I bring this up all the time because it's going to look really different than the way NIL works right now. So when we talk about some of these ACC programs or a place like North Carolina, I don't think they're going to be able to raise $20 million in NIL funds each year. But
Right.
if you use a rev share and everyone at the highest level, like in the Power Four, is spending, let's say it's 10 to 12 out of that 20 on football, and then there's NIL on top of it, the gap is smaller. So
Mhm.
it should help places like a North Carolina if they're committed to the rev share part of it. And that's why like Florida State and some of these other programs are like, this era is going to be better for us because we can't squeeze our donors the same way like Ohio State can
Right.
every year, but we can fund this from our school more, and that will close the gap.
No, to that point, I do think the gap gets smaller, but I mean, you just mentioned it, like, talking to some of the people I know in Columbus, like they're getting ready for another 20 million to put into next year's roster on top of whatever the rev share is for that program. Like the donors are fully ready. They're cool spending $1 million to get a tackle out of the portal, which is the going rate. And some schools aren't going to be able to do as much on top of it. So certainly the gap becomes narrow, but you talked about the amount of time that they had to spend getting comfortable. I think part of that time was Bill Belichick saying, listen, man, like I know we're not going to do necessarily what Ohio State's doing, but can you get me close in terms of our donors? Can they get us some of the funds so we can at least be in the neighborhood to be competitive there?
Yep. I think that is it's a great point.